Hello and welcome to Bible Pebbles. I'm glad you could join us today. The topic that we will be looking at today is who is your leader? We'll be looking further at Jeroboam. He had revolted against the king that was meant to be king over the nation of Israel, Rehoboam, and set up his own alternative state in the northern part of Israel, taking 10 of the 12 tribes with him. And that part, in the northern part, which we now know is around Samaria, that sort of region, became known as Israel. And the southern part, which was just 2 tribes, was known as Judah. So Jeroboam is now king of the northern part of Israel. He says to himself, these people may decide to go to Judah to worship God. He didn't want that because he was afraid that if they did, then they would return under the kingship and authority of Rehoboam, who was in the southern part, and he didn't want that. He wanted people under his control. He wanted people doing what he wanted them to do. The solution that he had for this, after asking for advice, was to set up his own religion. So he made 2 gold calves. One he placed in Bethel, and one he placed in Dan. Both these places were at the borders of the region in which his state was. And that is very telling. He doesn't want people to go to Jerusalem to worship God. He wants people to worship God, or his version of God, the way that he wants, where he wants, and how he wants. And we see this by setting up these golden calves, saying, this is your God. This is the God who brought you out of Egypt. This is the God that you should worship. Why should you go to Jerusalem to worship when you can worship here? He sets up his own priests. God had already directed the priests were to be from the tribe of Levi. But he just chooses anyone he wants. So that could be people that are his friends, people that are devoted and loyal to him. So it could be anybody. And people follow him. Now we know that worship of a golden calf is idolatry. It's not the way that God wants to be worshipped. It's not the way that God is meant to be worshipped. And these idols, these calves, don't represent God. They represent something God has made. And God has specifically said we are not to worship things that are made by us. We are only to worship God, who is spirit. These idols became a sin, and such a problem that God decided he didn't want Jeroboam, who he had placed in that position because of Solomon's sin. He didn't want his family to continue in that role anymore. So let's look at the type of person that Jeroboam was. Why did people follow him? Why did people choose to not go to Jerusalem to worship God? Why did they suddenly decide, oh, I'm just going to worship this golden calf? Because Jeroboam has said that we should worship this golden calf, that this golden calf is God. We know that Jeroboam was a very charismatic person. People easily followed him. He was a great warrior, and he was somebody that the people wanted around, and we see that with the rebellion against Rehoboam. Jeroboam had come back from exile in Egypt. People wanted him to come back, and together they came up against Rehoboam in revolt and decided they didn't want Rehoboam as their king, that they were going to follow Jeroboam instead. So we know that he's a very charismatic person, and people follow him. We can see that he wanted things done his way. He created his own priests. He created his own feast days. It was a counterfeit religion of what God had already put in place. He wanted people in his control. He didn't want people going to Jerusalem to worship God. He wanted people worshipping exactly where he had placed these golden calves. He wanted people worshipping in Bethel or in Dan. He didn't want them anywhere else. He had full control over where these people were. where these people lived, where these people worshipped. There is a right way to worship God, and there is a wrong way to worship God. And we see in this, Jeroboam rejected the right way, created the wrong way, and many people followed. These golden calves represent prosperity. Gold was a rich, abundant source, and even now today it's the standard from which our money is derived. So these people weren't just worshipping these golden calves, these images of things that God had created, but they were also worshipping prosperity, wealth. It gives the appearance of worshipping God, but it's not worshipping God, it's idolatry instead. It all started out all right. He started out worshipping God and then decided that he wanted a different way of doing things, but really it ended in tragedy. The tragedy for his family, the tragedy for the northern part of Israel, which God basically turned against in the end. These are the marks of a cult. It may appear to be all right, it may appear to worship God, but it really doesn't. When we look at cult leaders, we see that they're very charismatic people. People follow them. People like listening to what they have to say. They're people who want things their way. People who want things under their control. They're people that are not accountable to anyone else. Jeroboam wasn't accountable to anyone else. He was king. And they will lead people down the wrong path and into tragedy. These people will be manipulators. Jeroboam manipulated his people to get them to do what he wanted. And cult leaders will do the same as well. We need to be careful about who we have as our leaders. We need to be careful about who we are following, who we are listening to. Are we really worshipping God in the way that God has prescribed, in the way that God is wanting us to, in the way that he has set out in the Bible? Or are we following somebody's interpretation or idea of a God and how that should be worshipped? Or are we following somebody's idol that's not God? Are we following a leader who worships God in the way that God is wanting us to worship? Are we following a leader that sticks to the Bible? Or are we following a leader that does things their way, does things in a new way, in a way that goes against the Bible? This is why it is important to have the Bible as our baseline, as our foundation. Everything we do in our life and our worship to God should be based on that. Jeroboam, he didn't base his life, his worship on the Bible. He based it on what he wanted it to. And that's something we need to watch out for. I hope you've enjoyed it today. Feel free to leave any comments, and we shall see you next time. Thank you for listening.